Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Greg Peck. I'm an associate professor of horticulture at Cornell University, and be talking today about opportunities for mechanical apple harvesting for the cider industry. And I'm here with Joe Gaynor from Angry Orchard, and he's been one of our supporters and partners on some of these projects as we try to figure out what mechanical harvesting can look like for the United States. The story goes back, it goes back to when I really started working with the cider industry here and trying to figure out what's going on, how do we do this affordably. And we've been asking lots of questions about the orchard side of the cider industry in terms of what varieties to grow, how do we grow them for higher quality, and a whole series of projects that go to how do we do it cost effectively. So we started looking around and saying, okay, well, this isn't really new. It might be new for us here in the States and North America, but this isn't really new. So I started doing some comparisons and looking at, okay, well, what's happening in the rest of the world? So this is just what I call the cider economies. New York, where I'm based at Cornell University is, the United States and the United Kingdom, and just showing you some rough estimates in terms of domestic cider sales. We're about a $1.5 billion industry in the US. Some people might have more current stats, but it's hovered around there with when you add on and off premises together for a while. The UK is listed at about a $4 billion industry. So we're pretty big if you look at it as retail sales, but not quite as big as UK, which is the largest cider industry in the world. Now, if you look at apple acreage, New York, we're about 40,000. The entire country, about 300,000 acres of apples. And in the UK, it's pretty similar to New York, about just over 35,000 acres of apples. But what's unique is about half of that acreage are bitter apples or other types of apples that are specifically grown for the cider industry. So that's tremendous and very different. We've been trying to, for years, and we continue to try to get at this, figure out, well, how many acres of high tannin, bitter apples are being grown in the United States. And it's just tremendously difficult to get this data. We do surveys. We have one ongoing with the New York industry right now. We think we have about 200 acres or so in New York, but clearly, at about 18,000 acres in the United Kingdom for their cider industries. Look at another way just in terms of poundage and, just kind of follows those trends. And then gallons of cider produced, right? So, again, follows the trends for domestic sales. And this number of cider producers as well. It's interesting, right? So the number for New York, about 125, about half is what they have in the entire country of the United Kingdom. We have over 1,000 in the entire United States, but look at their cider sales. Very concentrated industry. The top 10 players really dominate everything they do there. And a lot of the production practices in the orchards really funnel from that because of that concentration and because they're supplying these big producers. And sophisticated in some ways, but efficient in other ways. And we'll look at that a little bit. Back in 2017, I think it was, had the opportunity with a bunch of New York producers go on a trip to England, sponsored by Angry Orchard and organized by Glenwood, which is a nonprofit in New York that was all about us going and learning about the cider industry in England. And so this is a group of folks here. You might recognize a lot of these people are here today still working with the industry, which is really pretty fantastic and just shows some of the longevity we have. So what did we see? Okay, so kind of this is the image, right, that a lot of people when they first start learning about cider apples have this picturesque orchard, animals grazing underneath, sheep on the left and cows on the right. And there are orchards like this. They're widely spaced. They're on seedling or standard size rootstocks, widely spaced, 10 by 18. The high limb line is because they're grazing animals underneath, and very low input orchards. And certainly there's a whole bunch of this around the countryside, but this is not where most of the apples are coming from. So we finally got around and started visiting some of the bigger producers and some of the contract growers that are growing for the big cider makers. And they have this system, they call it the bush cider orchard. It's somewhat similar, if you're familiar with like a vertical axe. It's somewhere between a vertical axe and a tall spindle, because it's two-dimensional, but like a semi-dwarf tall spindle. So more of a planar canopy, tall trees, much taller than we grow here, and much more widely spaced than we do for high-density fresh market apples, maybe only 300 trees per acre. And they've narrowed it down. About 60% of all apples in the UK are either Dabinet or Michelin. And they grow a handful of others. They grow the Girls, which is their new releases, which are mostly offspring of Dabinet and Michelin. And they're using semi-dwarf stocks, 106 and 111. They're the two that they really commonly use. So they have this wide row spacing because they're accommodating machinery. The whole idea in this is a low input mechanized orchard. And you can see here, this is fruit on the ground. So I went on this trip with Angry Orchard and Glenwood in the summer, and I was like, I got to come back and see how they're getting all these apples out of the orchards, right? So we have labor problems, right? If you're an apple grower, it's hard to find pickers, right? It's expensive. It's always an issue. It has always been an issue, and our political situation or our economic situation is not going to make that easier. They're also doing some mechanical pruning. They're using hedgers, against labor saving, and it's kind of sloppy, but it's okay. It's processing fruit, right? It's not their quality characteristics, what they're shooting for, are very different. So just kind of some comparisons between what I saw there in the United Kingdom and what we're doing here in New York. No trellis there. Most of our new orchards, particularly our fresh market apples, are all trellis. They're all high density. A lot of them are going in with irrigation as we start having more swing years, drought years because of climate change. No irrigation there. None. I didn't see a single irrigation line or anything. Very minimal spray. They have a few, they spray a little bit for scab. They have a couple of insect pests that some growers do. A lot of growers were like, yeah, some years my consultant, my agronomist comes by and tells me I should do this or that. Big difference also is that they're mechanically harvesting. So a lot of them, the bigger producers, will have their own machinery, and they use it for a couple months of the year. The rest of the year it's in the shed. But a lot of them also have it contract harvested. So this is something we don't have here for apples, but we do have here in the States for a lot of other crops, including wine grapes. A lot of our wine grapes are mechanically harvested, and a lot of that's done by outfits that specialize in that. They buy the machinery. A grape harvester could run upwards of $250,000, and they run that thing, basically nonstop for 3+ months out of the year, and that's how it works. Now, the other thing we learned when we were there is that the cider apple growers who are selling, particularly those that are selling to the larger operations, are not making much money. And so they're getting about $3.39 a bushel for bitter apples. Very different than here, right? They have very different supply and demand. They actually have probably too much supply of bitter apples, where we have barely enough bitter apples here. It's very hard to come by unless you're growing your own. So a lot of our growers are getting anywhere from $15 to $30 per bushel for a bitter apple, cider apple. So I work a lot with Whit Knickerbocker. He's the second author on this paper here. He did his undergrad degree at Cornell in Ag Econ, and now he works back on his family farm and drives combines and all sorts of things. So he's got this amazing skill set for this project, in that has background in economics and a background in machinery. So we've been kind of crunching numbers on this. Okay, how does it work for these guys in the UK? Well, it doesn't, right? That's a red line, right? So zero, anything above zero is profitable. Anything below zero, you're losing money on the gig. So this is an enterprise budget, or we call net present value calculation. It adjusts for a lot of factors that I won't go into the details of, but you can intuitively understand this. There is an initial cost at year one for planting, There's a deficit. They're losing money for the first 5 years or so, and that's because the trees are growing with no crop yet. They're not starting to produce apples. But even when they start producing apples, they are just not getting paid enough to even break even. So we punched some numbers in, and even if they were making a little bit more, like $3.89 a bushel as opposed to $3.39, they'd hit that after 25 years they would break even. So not a great system. And I talked to some of the growers there about it, and it's a real crisis for them. They're trying to figure this out as the market changes, and especially as some of the traditional types of cider that really made up a lot of the market, even from the big producers, Bulmers and such forth, are shifting to more fruit-based ciders. They're using a lot less apples, and they're using a lot less high tannin, bitter apples, and they're buying apple juice concentrate in from China, Poland, Turkey, etc. So we've also been looking at what's happening for our industry in New York. We ran budget numbers for 6 different case studies, and just some pictures there showing you what some of these different high-density orchards look like. Brown snout, everybody loves brown snout. It's like the most photogenic apple, right? It's got that little bit of russet right around the calyx end. So is it profitable to grow cider apples in New York? Well, for 5 of our 6 orchards it was. And they had a whole range of different planting systems, semi-dwarf trees to dwarf trees, some using irrigation, some not. And there was about a 4.7-fold difference in the expected prices. And that was a real eye-opener, is that people are charging a lot of different numbers for those bitter apples, depending on their contacts, depending on who they are and what their reputation is, and people want to get a hold of certain growers' fruit. And we have other people who are growing some of this fruit and maybe don't realize the full price of it, or just sell it similar to how they sell other apples at basically wholesale processing prices. So that was a big contributor to the profitability range. Others were labor, extremely variable labor inputs. And of course, we had some growers in the Hudson River Valley just north of New York City. So it's expensive to hire people there, right? There's a lot of competition for their labor. Housing's expensive, so the laborers, the pickers' costs are more. To growers who are up in the Lake Ontario region, and where it's more inexpensive to hire labor. So this one orchard here, I'll just highlight. This was our one orchard that was never profitable. They were not charging enough, but they also were trying to grow cider apples using the most sophisticated, expensive, high-density system that they would be growing Honeycrisp, or for us, Snapdragon, which is a new Cornell release, or any of these really high, direct, fresh market apples. And just never made money. Now, I said that the price is really variable. We did a calculation where we evened out the price, and we said, okay, everybody just charged 35 cents a pound for their fruit. And you can see there that, again, still 5 out of the 6 orchards were profitable. Number 6 just still couldn't, even though we raised their prices, they still weren't making enough money. They just spent too much money putting that orchard in, and their labor costs were too much. So it's processing fruit. Other orchards really varied in terms of when they're break even, where they start crossing that 0 line and start making money. And some of these orchards, the black and the dashed line here, tended to be a little bit more widely spaced trees, a little lower input, and their labor costs, of course, again, were lower. So, our system of cider apple growing is really based off of our fresh market apple industry. Our apples are still largely harvested by hand, and now there's some stuff coming in the pipeline. There's going to be robots and drones and all sorts of cool things that are going to be for the really big growers coming out in the next 5-10 years. But for a lot of us, a lot of the growers, it's still reliance on hand harvesting. Now they're efficient. They work hard. They can make a decent wage. They're often getting paid piece rate, so they get paid by how much they actually harvest. They can get up to $250 a day. They often work 6, sometimes 7 days a week during the harvest season. And they can pick and a tremendous amount of fruit, 12,000 pounds in a day. I mean, that's hard. But our system relies on 70,000 workers coming into the U.S. to pick apples. And, that's harder and harder to come by. There's systems in place. There's H-2A workers. The traditional system of migrant labor in the U.S. is really going away. Okay, so cider apples. Let's go back to them. How are they doing it? Well, most of the apples in England, France, Spain, many of these more established cider regions of the world are mechanically harvested like you see in the top left there, shake and sweep mechanisms. And I'll walk you through that. There has been some work in the U.S. Washington State University under Carol Miles has been doing some over-the-row harvesting, using berry harvesters or looking at some newer machines, trying to get the fruit right off of the trees. But most of the fruit is shaken off of the tree onto the ground and then swept up off the ground. Right? So the majority of the cider produced worldwide, this is how it's done. And it can be stored and handled very differently. So if you're an apple grower and you're selling fresh market apples, and what you see here on the far right looks like, is that just a compost heap? Like no, that is fruit that is sitting there waiting to go to the cidery. So they call these things clamps, these kind of concrete storage units, and they move these apples around with front end loaders, and they drop them into lorries, right? They call trucks. So we did some more economic analysis and kind of trying to figure out where can you make money at this? Like what is the amount of money you need to be making per bushel, and then if you compare hand versus machine harvesting. And so machine harvesting is always more efficient. It's the dashed line of the pear, and then the different colors throughout this chart here are showing you the different bushel returns. And these are still pretty low. These are pretty close to bottom there. It's kind of processing fruit, really the low end of processing fruit, up to kind of the low, maybe medium range of what some of our cider apple growers are getting for bitter fruit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the process. So this is a hydraulic shaker, trunk shaker. Just grabs the trunk and it shakes, right? Pretty cool. Right now a lot of that fruit's already on the ground, but there's a good video to show. So you can see all the leaves coming off. But those are Michelin apples on the ground. They're yellow apples, so they're a little hard to see with all the leaves. And it's probably 8 by 18. And they'll go through, they can do one shaker, one guy on a tractor, right? Just one person can go through and do about 10 acres in a day. And they can do this up to a week before harvest. And there's a lot of natural fruit drop as well, right? A lot of that fruit is just naturally dropping. So then the next step is that they're sweeping the apples. So they're putting them into windrows. So that front piece of equipment there in blue, it's kind of the chevron grid to it, and it's just moving the apples to the sides. They may do a pass beforehand, depending on how many apples are on the ground with that, or they'll also use a blower sometimes. They'll have a blower attached to the PTO of the tractor to roll the apples over. Apples are remarkable, right? They're round balls. They can actually push them with air, high velocity air pretty easily. And then they pick them up. And you can see here are those Michelin apples in the bottom right. The video's going. Zooming in. Look at that. Not gentle, right? So that's one machine. The blue one is one company. Here's that same machine, just a different angle. You can see the wheel going around. And it kicks it into this kind of track here, conveyor belt with these rods. Picks them up like the potato harvester does. This one over here, it's okay. But that's just another manufacturer. This is a different model, same concept. And then they go into trailers. And again, not very gentle. So sometimes the manufacturers, we never have a drop of more than 4 inches or something during the whole process line. Until you get to the end, they drop out of the conveyor onto the ground. And you can see here's just some of what that pickup mechanism looks like on a lot of these kind of potato harvester. If you use these rods, and they just kind of compress the apples and pick them up. Piles and piles of apples. I'm just so happy. It was just awesome. I mean, look at all that. And you can see here, bottom left, that's a front end loader moving apples around. So they sweat the apples, right? You've probably heard that term if you've worked with cider apples. They just sit on them. They're just letting them ripen, right? That's basically what sweating is. They're letting the starch convert to sugar. They get a little bit of dehydration, so you get some concentration of some of the chemicals, sugar acids, phenolics may concentrate in that process. But most of the time they're waiting on, they're sweating because they're waiting. They're waiting for the cider manufacturer to accept their load. And so they get slotted in as to when they can deliver apples. Their quality control here are those rods, those metal rods. This is Bulmer's, the largest cider maker in the world. This is 30 tons of apples. And these trucks were just coming in, one after another. So I asked if I could swing the hammer, and he said no. It's like, it wasn't even a question. He's like, I'm not letting you near this thing. He was like Thor. So fruit quality says it all in the picture, right? It's pretty poor. Banged up, bruised up, rotted. And this is after they were sorting at this facility. This is not Bulmer's. This is somewhere else. You can see some leaves in there. They do put them into water, so a lot of them will clean them. They get sprayed off. They'll get washed a little bit. But their biggest one is rocks. Rocks are a real issue for them because if a rock gets into their mill, that's a problem, right? So a lot of us who hand harvest fruit right now, we're not dealing with that. We don't have to, it's very rare to get a rock in there. So let's just go back and reflect a bit. In the United Kingdom, cider apples are largely sold through contracts with large-scale cider producers, right? So it's a very different supply chain than what we have here in the U.S. Top 10 producers are probably using more than 95% of all the apples. Bulmer's alone is probably about half of all the apples. So they're probably taking about a quarter of all apples grown in the United Kingdom go to Bulmer's. At least it was a few years ago. It's really kind of shifted for them recently. But then they own their own orchards. They do have their own, but they contract grow. About 120 different growers will contract grow with them. They have these long-term contracts, 20, 25-year-long contracts. And some of the other big producers like Thatcher's, Weston's, they buy about another 10%. Reflecting on all this, and I still say to myself, well, if we want to scale up, if we really want more, and personally, I love cider with a nice tannic backbone. I love cider apples. So I want to see it more in our products. Maybe it's not the majority of the industry, but I think we can find ways to try to scale this up, try to make cider apples more affordable. Now, we're probably not going to have that many large-scale operations. We're not going to have these large Bulmer's types of orchards and these long-term contracts, at least not now. Maybe we'll get there eventually, but not now. So we have to look at this at multiple scales. So I sat down with Whit Knickerbocker and with one of my former Ph.D. students. I said, okay, well, let's model this out. Let's see if we can make this work for small, medium, and large-scale operations. So we did some more budget work, and there are small, medium, large, or 5, 15, and 60-acre operations. And here's just some of the different types of equipment that we were looking at. This is Silver Fox. This thing is just battery operated. I mean, this is the smallest scale. This is pretty efficient, though. This is just us. We just threw some apples on the ground to do a demo of it. If you're a small scale, 5 acres, you could run this. You run this for 3 months, right? So you're not trying to pick up all your apples in one day with this. That'd be exhausting. But hey, if you're running this, you've got a couple of them even. It's a heck of a lot better than crawling on your hands and knees, if you ask me. But I'm getting older, so I don't like that as much. I'm not sure if we can get this one to play or not. Yeah, that one did play. That's another one. That one has actual mechanism in it. This is a really common machine. This is our medium scale one. This is Patent Grouse, self-propelled machine. And then in the back there, it's got the catch where the apples go into, and that is on the far right there. You can see that it has its own hydraulic system, and they dump it right in. Does a really nice job. That thing can also be used on larger scale or larger, more widely spaced plantings. Some of the big producers have their own, like these things are like garbage truck size, self-contained, and they can fly through acres and acres of orchards in a day. And one person just going through, picking up picking up apples all through the season. So we modeled it out, some examples here, and there's a paper on this if you want to get into the details. But just to give you some ideas, like that patent and grouse was about $45K US. That large one that's like a garbage truck size is, about $167,000, just to give you some idea of what these things cost. So here's some of the budget information. Now we're saying, okay, well, let's try it on what our growers are doing, right? Let's try it on a orchard 4 by 4 feet between trees, 12 feet between rows, kind of really common system for a lot of our growers in New York. And we ran some partial budgets just to compare, is it more cost effective to hand harvest, or is it more cost effective to machine harvest? As labor goes up in expense, which labor always gets more expensive, when does labor ever get less expensive? It's only going to become more economically sustainable to mechanically harvest, right? And so here are just some of our rates. Okay, so that's some of the details on it. If you want to geek out on it, I'll share the paper. Here's the link. There's a link to it. It's free. We make sure to try to get all of our science into journals that will make it accessible to whoever wants to look at it. So here's some of the conclusions. Like, here's the headline. The headline is, mechanical harvesting hard cider apples is more economically favorable than hand harvesting, regardless of farm scale. So if you match the right size machine to the size of your operation, you're going to come out ahead, right? You might be using one of those push mower type things, right? You may not have a nice fancy one that has all the bells and whistles that you're driving around on. It's still going to be worthwhile. And we run the numbers, and you can kind of see, the all economy of scale. The larger the operation, the more you're going to save money on mechanical harvesting. Part of this operation, right, is getting the apples off of the tree and onto the ground. So we looked at some different ways of doing this. We looked at a cable shaker, which is pretty inexpensive to purchase, a couple $1,000, and basically attaches to the PTO. It's a cable, and you just wrap it around the trunk of a tree, and then it has like a little pneumatic thing, or hydraulic thing rather, on the tractor, and just shakes the tree, and everything comes down. Versus a tree trunk shaker. And we looked at some different things, and basically it's better to get a trunk shaker, hydraulic shaker, versus a cable shaker, because you have one person versus two over the lifespan of the machine. And so this is just showing that as labor gets less expensive, it's still more cost effective to hand harvest, but especially at the bottom there, as labor gets more expensive, it just becomes more and more cost effective to be mechanically harvesting. It's intuitive, it makes sense, but we ran the numbers just to prove it. So here I am smiling again in front of giant piles of apples, because that's where, love to see that. So apple harvesters are currently available, right? You can purchase them. We purchased one for a project that we'll talk about in a few slides. We have some dealers in North America. There's one in Quebec that we're working with that is bringing them in, or you can bring them in independently through one of the other manufacturers. That's a possibility as well. It's going to save money. And what about fruit quality, right? So fruit bruising is acceptable for cider apples. I think a lot of cider producers can be kind of fussy about the quality of fruit going in, but I think a lot of fruit can be mechanically harvested. It is not going to be pretty. It's going to be banged up, but it can still be used for cider. Now, what you lose on the gig is long-term storage, right? Because once you bruise that apple or you nick it, then you're not going to be able to stick it in the cold storage facility and pull it out 2, 3, 6 months later, right? It's different. It's a different way of thinking about how are we going to deal with apples if we're going to start mechanically harvesting. Food safety questions always come up when I give this presentation, right? So we're getting apples off the ground, and our industry, based off of fresh market and juice industry, and a lot of our in the eastern U.S. are familiar with cider, sweet cider, and pick your own operation. So there's a lot of regulation around that. There's been some E. coli issues with apple juice and cider in the past, and so the thought is, well, you can't use ground harvested apples for hard cider. Not true. You can. And even under the new Food Safety Modernization Act, which is the new federal regulations for food safety of agricultural products, it is allowable to use ground harvested fruit. Now, there's some more paperwork involved, and you should talk to your local food safety regulators and find out some of the details. But there's, you want to make sure that if you're ground harvesting, that fruit doesn't somehow end up into unfermented product, right? You want to make sure that fruit is destined for fermentation. And it's certainly not going to be for fresh market. Was your question? Yeah. So the question was, what about at the cider mill? What about separating fruit at the cider mill?
Separating the fruit, but that the same cider mill for...
Right, so the same cider mill being used for fresh juice and hard cider production as well. It's a great question. I'm guessing that there are HACCP plans and certain cleaning steps that you'll have to follow when you switch from one product to the next. But I don't think it's like you need a separate mill and press, right? I think you can clean it.
But have you asked?
I have not asked. So, and certain states are different. New York is very favorable to this. That question specifically would have to ask somebody who's a regulator and not me. So Wisconsin's different. So there are some state differences, and that might be something as we move towards mechanical harvesting that we ask our ACA, the American Cider Association, to help get some more clarification on that. Right? We haven't had the industry get there yet, where this has come up, but we're heading there, and I'm going to keep pushing us that way because I think we need to go there. Now, minimal risk of enteropathogenic organisms in fermented cider. Been shown many times in many studies, basically through both the fermentation of the juice itself, right, which destroys either the organism or the potentially dangerous compounds that they make, or having a low alcohol solution, right, can also be something that is antiseptic. Now, of course, when you start working on this stuff, you get called into other things, and pathologists get involved, and so they find some cool things. And so there are, it's not 100%, right? So this is, we have this in preprint now, and plant pathologist colleague, did find one organism in New York soils that can have patulin contamination in hard cider. So it's something that we still need to think through and be careful of. We don't have any cases of this, and we have no record of any fresh apple juice coming from ground harvested apples, which it happens in New York, causing this, but just something to be aware of. Looking at New York, we looked at England, we looked at the economics, kind of trying to figure it out. There's regulatory issues that will continue to come up and as we start trying to push the limits on it. Started working just this past year with Angry Orchard, and here's Joe in the picture, and Jeff Christ in the middle, who's our farm, works with Joe, a farm manager there. And we got a grant from the New York Farm Viability Institute to purchase this machine back here. Actually, Angry Orchard bought this, and we're leasing it for part of this project. It's a Kraus SF1000A. It's about $50K. And it has a 2-bin trailer on it, but it also does have like that hydraulic dump system like in that grouse, the patented grouse. And we purchased this from Produce Tech, and they're up in Quebec. We'll give them a little plug because they've been very supportive. So here's what, okay, here it is. So top right one is moving, and this is what it does. It's got a sweep, and this is a high density system. And it's sweeping the apples towards that blue tarp. So it's windrowing them that way, a little different than some of the other models that I've shown earlier. I don't sell any of this stuff, and there's different models. There's probably people want to geek out on like which is more efficient, but this worked pretty well. Here's another angle on it. That's Whit. So he's the economist and also the tractor driver for this project. And you can see here in the front here, this is a fan. Kind of went quickly. If I can get around to it again. Apples just drop in there. There's Ian Merwin. Oh, yeah, this is at Ian Merwin's orchard. We tried it over at his orchard. So there's the fan there. So you can blow apples into the next row, and then when you come around that row, and then you pick them up that time. So it does pick up rocks. So that's what I'm showing there. So that would be a problem, and Jill will speak to that in a minute. So getting apples off of the tree is something we're still trying to sort out. It's doing it reverse. This is a shaker. Shaker. It's a prototype system we borrowed from the USDA in Kearneysville, West Virginia. And I said, I want to try this in high density apple orchard. So Joe said, okay. Thank you. And it's a beefy machine. It's overkill for what we're doing here, but conceptually, I'm pretty excited by this. And they use this for harvesting of citrus. And the rods there, those white rods on the central axis, they're just moving as it hits the trunk of the tree or trellis post, right? And it's just oscillating back and forth. So it just to try to free it up from the branches, because we don't want it to do. You don't want it spinning, because you'll beat your tree up. And you can see it's a little overkill. Look at all that shaking going on there. But it does a really nice job of taking apples off the tree. So we're looking at this. I'm working with an engineering firm, and we're seeing if we can downscale this and maybe even make it so it's a shake and catch. You know, can we have a conveyor or something underneath it that gets the apples before they even go to the ground? This is Campagnola, if you know fishing gear or bike equipment. They also make a bunch of harvesting stuff. This is their limb shaker that they sell. It's run off of an air compressor. It's pneumatic. And that's Mike, my technician there. And it didn't really do as much as I was hoping. I was really excited by it as kind of an inexpensive way of shaking limbs, but ended up using it kind of like a panking pole. We just would hook it up there in the end. Even though we were running it, we ended up just kind of pulling back and forth to shake the apples off. So we're looking at physical approaches, also chemical approaches to getting apples off the tree. So we play with plant growth regulators. So we have certain plant growth regulators that prevent pre-harvest drop, and then we have others that accelerate pre-harvest drop. And so we've been using both of them, various rates and combinations. Because we have these chemicals and because they're labeled for apples, they're commonly used actually. So if you're familiar with fresh market production or even with pick-your-own operations, a lot of pick-your-own operations will use this to keep the apples on the tree, so when the customers come by, the apples are still there. And so we have been kind of messing around with them a little bit to say, okay, can we stick the apples onto the tree with either auxin and an NAA or with retain, which is an ethylene inhibitor, and then spray them with ethifon. And then ethifon is basically ethylene that we spray on it, which will cause the ripening process to start and the fruit to drop. So I'll get to your question in one sec. So we're playing with the idea of sticking them and then dropping them when you want, so the apples aren't on the ground so long. So one of the things we really learned about the industries in both the United Kingdom, in the western part of the United Kingdom, and also France, Normandy, northern. These are cool maritime climates. And apples can hang around on the ground for quite a while. In New York, we can have some pretty hot weather during harvest, and that fruit will go south quickly. So if we can hold them on the tree longer and not have them be on the ground, that's the benefit. And especially with some of the high tannin varieties, which have a lot of pre-harvest drop. The question up front.
Yeah.
So the question was, what are we trying this on? And so we're trying a lot of traditional varieties. And here we have Chisel Jersey, Brown Snout, Harry Masters Jersey, Binet Rouge, Dabinets. We also had Golden Russet and Porter's Perfection in here. And so it can work, and especially for varieties that drop a lot, it works really well to play around with these plant growth regulators. For varieties that don't drop a lot, like Golden Russet, Porter's Perfection, there's really not a lot of need for doing this technique. So that's kind of where we are. I'll get to the question, and I'm going to pass it off to Joe. And that's Joe there. I got Joe on the harvester, and he got some experience with it this year, and also ran some fermentation trials. So we're testing this from multiple angles and just trying to really just learn this year a lot. There's a question. So the question is, what about the harvesters and these were traditionally used for tart cherries, for example, and they look like almost like an upside down umbrella, and they unfurl around the trunk of a tree, and then they also have a tree shaker, just like I showed earlier, and then it shakes onto that, and then there's a conveyor belt on there. And yeah, we had a grower who had some tart cherries and had some cider apples, and we went up and I said, well, let's go give it a try. And he's like, okay, let's give it a try. People are really nice to me. I don't know why they want to do all this stuff to their trees, but they do. And that works. It works. It's slow, but there's no reason why you can't. We did that with him in 2021. And then last year what he did is he went and I started talking to him about the plant growth regulators. And he sprayed ethifon on the trees. I forget how, maybe 7 or 14 days before he went and did that. and he was loving it. And so he did that with a lot of his crab apples, which are a real pain to harvest because they're so small. And yeah, so yeah, can work. There's lots of different ways, lots of different crops that are harvested different ways. We're thinking about high density systems because that's what a lot of our growers are heading towards, and kind of more of a continuous harvest versus a machine like that, which is discrete. You set it up around one tree, you harvest it, and then you move to the next one. But if, and you can find those, what's it, FMC, I think was the manufacturer for those for tart cherries, so you might be able to find them around, or you know, especially in areas where there were tart cherry industries. Okay, Joe, what was your experience?
It's great. No.
Great,
no,
we're done.
So, yeah. No, so, and, I mean, it was pretty cool. So for those of you that might not know, Angry Orchard has a 60-acre orchard in Walden, New York. And really the whole purpose of it is to be innovative from the planting all the way into the packaging, and have an opportunity to play with fruit and play with cider in a special way that, you know, hopefully helps out the industry as well too. So to be able to, you know, jump on this project with Dr. Peck has been really incredible. We got a harvester to kind of support the research, and it was interesting. You know, we're still operating at that orchard. So Jeff Christ, the farm manager we're working with, comes from a totally culinary background. They have one of the largest packing plants in New York State. Everything's handpicked. We get a crew, and we get very clean fruit. You know, we're even, you know, we're actually using some of their bins. So specifically, like, everything was at that food grade handpicked quality. So bringing this kind of equipment in really changed the method that we were working with him, as, you know, at every level. Like, we have to, you know, segregate special bins that aren't going into the food program, so on and so forth. So it was really interesting to build it out this year, and we only got the harvester about halfway through the harvest this year. So we kind of just got our feet dipped into the water a little bit while we're kind of starting to plan out trials for next year. But on the farm, you know, we have 30 different varieties of apples. Some of those varieties growing on 5 or 6 different rootstocks, even all the way from, you know, 938 to 41, all different sizes, and you know, that harvester really. And the shaker, which scared the hell out of me, that shaker, all kind of, you know, work, you know, on different trees, different stocks, kind of worked in a little bit of a different way, and varieties too. So really some of our early findings are that some sizes and some varieties work, you know, sizes of trees and some varieties of apples work a lot better. You know, Michelin, for example, you know, it's funny that it's one of the bigger ones in England because it's a very stiff apple. It doesn't get beat up a lot as it falls on the ground, and doesn't get beat up in the machine. So even picking that up off the ground, going through the spinner, they're not getting too beat up where, you know, you're looking into you know, like some of the pictures Greg showed that can be a little scary. Same with Porter's Perfection. We did a couple rows of Porter's Perfection. You know, they're a little smaller, they're a little denser, hard apples again, thick skin, and they were coming out great kind of on the back end of the machine. And then we got into things like Yarlington Mill, a little bit of a softer skin, easier to bruise apple, and those bins were a little scary looking. So I think, you know, as we move into next year, we have these individual sections, these specific varieties, and we can kind of dial in where it works the best and what it works the best on for that specific machine we're operating. Storage, you know, it changes the way we store things too. So again, just getting it halfway through harvest this year and being able to play with it, I think one of the first days is we kind of ran it through the orchard, did a couple sections, and got 8 bins. I put them into our apple storage, walked in the next day, and we have to press these today, which I'm sure everybody's kind of thinking about with the bruising and the process, stuff like that. So it just kind of started moving the gears in our mind as, you know, you need the tank space right away. Everything, you know, in that culinary world we're talking about, again, everything's geared towards storing apples for 3 months and then pressing as you kind of get space. Whereas you go to Ballmer's and there's 100 million gallon tanks outside the building, because the entire process has nothing to do with storing fruit, has to do with stocking it, pressing it, and filling those tanks. So even on a small scale, right away we're like, we need, you know, if we're gonna continue to mechanically harvest the fruit in the orchard, we're gonna have to build out tank space to kind of match what we're gonna do with the mechanical harvesting space. And then, you know, fruit juice, cider quality. The fruit that we did intentionally harvest and ferment, we had no problems with. You know, we didn't store it for any longer than that 1 or 2 days, like we were talking about. We tried to use the harvester on a Monday to, you know, give us the week just in case. And it turned out pretty great. We actually fermented some of the cider, and actually on one of them, even some of the cleaner stuff did a wild fermentation just to see how that would go, and everything came out pretty nice with no big bugs, no bad bacteria, fortunately. We're kind of excited to use it into the next year, and fruit milling too. We use a Kruzmeyer press, so we also have a water bath, which eliminates that issue with rocks, which was a big issue. It did pick up all of the rocks in the orchard.
Yeah.
The orchard looks nicer though now. So this was our first year doing it, and definitely noticed some damage from the oscillator machine. But I think, like Greg said, that was just kind of like a test run in small sections and an opportunity to look at that machine and see if it could be actually scaled down to work more appropriately.
So yeah, and so that's a really great question, and we'll continue to look at the issue. The question was about, if you're shaking a tree, are you also potentially breaking off your spurs, which is your fruit, your flowers for the next year's fruit? And yes, that could be a concern. I think also that's where Ethifon could really come in handy, and if you're, because that'll really loosen up the fruit and just drop it right off. So it depends. I think we still have work to do to figure out how to get fruit shaken off trees onto the ground. That big trunk shaker is going to be overkill for a tall spindle or even a vertical axe system. So we're looking at things that maybe clamp onto wires, maybe things that clamp onto posts, and trying to shake the whole trellis. I don't know. We're trying to think creatively about how to do this.